Hey, what's up, Clarence?
Hey, how you doing, Rob?
Hey, not too bad.
All right,
Just
what you guys doing?
going over the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, you know a lot about that?
Not really, but we can go over it.
All right. Well, I guess basically to kind of understand how we got to the Treaty of Versailles, we have to understand what started it in the first place. And that was World War One and the Armistice Agreement. Do you know what that was?
No, exactly what is that?
The Armistice Agreement, it's basically a ceasefire that stopped all the fighting in World War One between the Allied side and the Central Powers side. And then about a year or so after that, we had to determine, okay, how are we going to govern this going forward?
Okay.
So that's when they decided to all get together at Louis XIV's palace in Paris, which was called the Palace of Versailles, hence where we got the Treaty of Versailles.
Now, another interesting point to look at is figuring out how it split up all of the countries. Now, once we're talking about the U.S., who, of course, the leader Woodrow Wilson, Great Britain with David Lloyd George, France with George Clemenceau, and Italy, who was not a major factor going into it near the end, was Vittorio Orlando. And the biggest blame, sadly, went to Germany, which was Article 231, which just gave all the sole responsibility of the war and all the damage and all the death to Germany, unfairly spoken. And if you hadn't known, Germany owed $33 billion in war damages for all of the damage that they had supposedly caused, which was, again, unfairly spoken to. And what was the main point or points you think, Clarence, that Wilson spoke about?
Okay, he had the 14 points, I do know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the 14 points kind of revolved around the free trade, self-determination, the rights of certain communities, and then freedom of trade, or freedom of the seas, I'm sorry, and then also to the end of secret treaties. And that's about all I really know about the 14 points.
Well, what is interesting about that is sometime after World War One, Wilson really felt like he saved the world. Because, you know, World War One had started in 1914, but the United States didn't enter until 1917. 1918, we have the Armistice Agreement.
Okay.
So Wilson, he wanted the whole world to know, hey, look what I did. So he comes up with these 14 points and tries to establish how we're going to, you know, how we're governing things going forward, basically. And of course, the first part of it is extremely pro-United States and its agendas. But one thing Wilson really wanted, he was kind of a visionary in that sense, he wanted a new democratic world order. Basically, he wanted to create a League of Nations, almost like the
Cool kids?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's an interesting way to look at it, yeah. And kind of like the UN 1.0 in a sense.
Okay.
The whole thing is, though, is that it was pretty evident that we would find out that all these members of the Big Three, each of them would have different agendas as far as what they wanted to get out of the Treaty of Versailles and how they wanted to see their opponents in World War One be treated as such.
Okay.
Like, most definitely, like when you're speaking about Wilson having sort of like a God complex, him seeking glory with his 14 points and him stating that he came in and he saved the day, and obviously his allies who they didn't agree, Clemenceau and David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was interested in the financial aspects, getting as much money as he could from the freedom of trade and freedom of the seas, and whereas Clemenceau felt that there had been some wrongdoings in the Franco-Prussian War, and it was more of he felt like he had to avenge the French people. So it was, in terms, Wilson, glory, Britain, money, and France solely with a sense of revenge. And the hypocrisy of Wilson, for example, was his whole idea of self-determination, countries stating, oh, if you feel like you can rise up and be your own people and claim that this is, you know, one area, this is another area, you're free to do so. But when an example greatly exemplified was Ho Chi Minh, who went to Wilson and said, hey, we want to be free, and he rejected him because, as we all know, Wilson was a racist and had prejudice against anybody who wasn't a democratic white. So that of course caused a lot of animosity and caused a lot of other nations to rise up and be against him, because even though he felt he saved the world, many peoples didn't feel that way. So
He was also experiencing that here at home because the Republicans were really lashing out against him. They felt that he was not making very good decisions, and his arrogance had just gotten to the point where he didn't even bring a single Republican to the peace talks with him. So how do you think that impacted him politically when he got back to the United States?
Well, it didn't happen. It didn't help him at all. But who came out on top of self-determination?
Well, as far as self-determination is concerned, I mean, there were two nations that were a prime example of the failure of it, which was Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Now, those two countries were created even though those people were German-speaking citizens and Serbian-speaking citizens, respectively, and you know, that basically contradicted everything. They wanted to be Germans, they wanted to be Serbians, they wanted to be part of other nations, but the Allied powers were also thinking in the back of their mind, they didn't want them getting too big. You know, they didn't want them getting too powerful, thanks to this book right here, The Influence of Sea Power. All these countries, it was a how-to guide on how to become the most powerful nation in the entire world. Poland gets wind of this. Poland sees that, hey, we're giving land out like it's hotcakes, so
Everybody likes hotcakes.
we got, yeah, they do, and we got a
Of
lot
course.
of land taken from us over the last hundreds of years. I think we want that back too, because, you know, we used to be quite the heavy empire ourselves. The Allies took that as a good opportunity, and they were able to divide up other land that was originally supposed to be given to Russia. Because remember, Russia and Germany had made that agreement, so Russia really didn't have a part in the Paris peace talks. But what's the irony of it was that all the stuff that was given to Germany with their agreement with Russia was just taken right back from them in the Treaty of Versailles.
Okay.
So we definitely have to look at, after all of the losses and the gains, we'd have to look at what was the final judgment per se of the Treaty of Versailles. You know, who's to blame for World War I causing this whole Treaty of Versailles? Like when we're speaking about this, everyone obviously wants to blame Germany, but we all know it wasn't Germany's fault solely. They were definitely a big advocate for the violence and the death and all the destruction, but we all know that it was either everyone's fault because they commingled and they propagated that situation, or it was no one's fault. But history has obviously taught us wrongly that it was just one country's sole fault. And because of all that blame, it of course caused a stir up of hatred and anger leading up to Hitler and World War II. So that's definitely a large factor that hasn't been taken into consideration with the whole issue.
So who's the biggest losers in the whole treaty?
Well, if you were asked me, I would say the biggest losers would definitely be Germany, of course.
Okay.
You can definitely say Japan, because Japan wasn't even really included in all of this. And the whole funny thing about it was that all they really wanted to do was they wanted to be compensated for their efforts, and they wanted to be treated as equals. Because remember, Europe kind of looked at Asia as a lower class. Every innovation they felt that Asia had was because of them. So they certainly weren't interested in, especially Wilson, with his closet racism, was not interested at all viewing them as their equals. So they were just cast to the side. And then another big loser in all of this, I would say, would be the United States. I mean, since Wilson lost control of the Senate and the House back stateside, we weren't even able to get this treaty ratified. And as a result of that, we couldn't even join the League of Nations. And all Wilson was left holding on to was, well, we didn't get to do everything that I wanted to get to do, but we got a League of Nations that we weren't even a part of. It just seemed like such a consolation prize. I'm not sure why we were, you know. Another area that we can't forget was the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that entire area, Persia, into what we know now as the Middle East, that's how we got Iran, that's how we got Iraq. And these were people that did not want to they did not want to be a part of that new type of landscape. But what's ironic though, are you seeing a pattern with what was it that the Middle East had that all of a sudden the entire world was interested in having?
What's that? Oil?
Oil, exactly. Bingo. So now all of a sudden, the Ottoman Empire, who had been flourishing for more than 500 years, ever since Suleiman the Magnificent, now all of a sudden, now that oil is such a hot commodity and there's such a demand for it, now all of a sudden the Allies have an issue with how they're doing things out there. You know, so you definitely got to say Great Britain, France, and even Poland for getting all this land back, and they virtually did nothing. Those had to be the biggest winners of this treaty.
That's pretty insightful.
Yeah.
So there you have it, a pretty decent overview of the effects of the Treaty of Versailles.
That was pretty quick. I didn't expect to learn so much in short time there.
Yeah,
Well, that's how we do things out here at Valencia.
we get it done.
Sounds great. Peace. All right, we're done.
How long was that?